The plate shattered against the wall 3 inches from Jennie Cooper's head. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at things like that 6 weeks ago, somewhere between the Missouri River crossing and the first time she had walked through the doors of the Fairchild Ranch house, and understood with crystalline certainty that she had stepped into the most chaotic, ungoverned household in the entire territory of Colorado. But this was different. This was not one of the boys throwing food across the table in a fit of boredom. This was Cyrus Fairchild himself, standing at the far end of that table with his jaw set like stone and his gray eyes burning with something that looked like fury but felt, to anyone paying close enough attention, like something raw and desperate and terrified underneath. "Get out," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Men who screamed were manageable. Men who went quiet like the sky before a tornado were something else entirely. "I will not," Jennie said. The table between them was 10 feet long, scarred with knife marks and boot prints, and the ghost of 100 meals eaten without grace or gratitude. The 3 boys sat frozen at their places, the oldest with a spoonful of beans suspended halfway to his mouth, the middle one gripping the edge of the bench with both hands, the youngest with his face turned up toward Jennie like a sunflower finding the one source of light in a dark room. "Miss Cooper," Cyrus bit each word off separately, "I hired you to teach reading and arithmetic. I did not hire you to rearrange my household, reorganize my kitchen, redecorate my son's bedroom, or tell my foreman how to speak to his employer." "Your foreman needed to be told," Jennie said. "He was stealing from you. 3 months of supply accounts, padded by nearly $40. And as for your sons, my sons are not your concern beyond their letters and their numbers. Your sons," Jennie said, and her voice was very steady and very clear, "do not know how to address a woman without cursing. They do not know how to sit at a table without fighting. They do not know what please and thank you mean. They cannot look a person in the eye without being taught it is not weakness. They are 9, 11, and 13 years old, Mr. Fairchild, and nobody has taught them any of it. Not one soul in this house has tried, until now." The silence after that was the loudest thing Jennie had ever heard. Cyrus stared at her across that long table, and the fury in his eyes shifted, cracked, showed something underneath it that she was not meant to see. His hands, flat against the tablecloth, curled slowly into fists. "Pack your things," he said. "No," said the youngest boy. Everyone in the room turned to look at Eli Fairchild, who was 9 years old, gap-toothed, and had not spoken in the presence of his father for 11 days by Jennie's careful count. "No," Eli said again, louder. He looked at his father and his chin was trembling, but he did not look away. "Please, Papa, please don't send her away." That was 6 weeks ago. This is how it began. Jennie Cooper arrived in the town of Harrow Creek, Colorado, on the 14th of April, 1873, on the afternoon stage from Denver. She had $32 in her purse, a trunk containing every book she owned, a letter of engagement folded precisely into thirds, and absolutely no illusions about the kind of situation she was walking into. She was 26 years old. She had been teaching school in Cincinnati since she was 19, first in the public schoolroom on 4th Street, and then, after the school board replaced her with a man who had half her competence and twice her connections, in private homes. She was smart, she was practical, she was not easily frightened, and she had answered the advertisement in the Denver Rocky Mountain News not because she had no other options but because the advertisement itself had struck her as the most honest thing she had read in months. It had said simply, "Schoolteacher wanted. 3 boys ages 9, 11, 13. Remote ranch 12 miles outside Harrow Creek, Colorado territory. Room and board provided. $15 per month. No nonsense. Inquire C. Fairchild, Harrow Creek Post Office. No promises of a warm and welcoming family. No descriptions of charming countryside. No nonsense." Jennie had written her letter of inquiry and received, 2 weeks later, a reply written in a hand that was blunt and economical and said precisely what it meant. She had accepted. What the advertisement had not said, And what no one in Harrow Creek seemed eager to volunteer when she stepped off the stage was that Cyrus Fairchild had been raising 3 boys alone for 4 years since the death of his wife, that the ranch had been slowly fraying at the edges from the inside out, that the boys had run off 2 previous governesses within a combined total of 3 weeks, and that Cyrus Fairchild himself was considered by the general population of Harrow Creek to be the most difficult man in the county. She learned the last part from the stage driver, who mentioned it with cheerful helpfulness while unloading her trunk. "Difficult how?" Jennie asked. "Closed up like a vault," the driver said. "Since his wife passed, fine man once, I'm told, good neighbor, reasonable. Now he just keeps to himself and runs that ranch like a military operation, and nobody can get 2 friendly words out of him." "I'm not going there for friendly words," Jennie said. The driver squinted at her. "No, I suppose you're going there for the boys." "I am going there to do a job," Jennie said, "which is what I intend to do." She hired the liveryman's wagon for 50 cents and rode the 12 miles out to the Fairchild Ranch in the late afternoon light, watching the mountains to the west turn gold and then copper, and then the particular shade of purple that existed only in high country at dusk. She had grown up in Ohio. She had never in her life seen mountains like this, and she was not the sort of woman to pretend she was not moved by them. The ranch itself surprised her. She had expected neglect, and there was some. The fence line needed repair along the north pasture, and the garden was a dead tangle of last year's stems. But the buildings were solid, and the horses in the paddock were in excellent condition, and the whole place had the bones of something that had once been well tended and could be again. Cyrus Fairchild met her on the porch. She had formed no particular image of him from his letter, only that he was a man who said what he meant and did not bother with pleasantries. In person, he was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who worked physically every day of his life, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind, and something less external than either of those things. He was 38 years old. She would learn later, though she might have guessed younger if not for the particular quality of stillness around his eyes, the kind that came not from peace but from grief that had been very thoroughly contained. He looked at her as though he had been expecting someone different and was now revising his assessment in real time. "Miss Cooper," he said. "Mr. Fairchild." She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go as quickly as politeness allowed. "The boys are inside," he said. "I'll show you your room and then you can meet them." "All right," she said. He carried her trunk himself, which she had not expected, and showed her to a room at the back of the house that was small but clean and had a window that faced east toward the plains. There was a bed, a washstand, a good lamp, and a shelf that was clearly empty in anticipation of her books. She noticed the shelf. She thought that was something. "Meals are at 6, 12, and 6, Cyrus said, standing in the doorway. "I'm usually out before sunrise. The boys do morning chores before lessons." "What time do you want to start?" 8 o'clock, Jennie said. "After chores and breakfast." He nodded. He was about to turn away. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, "what can you tell me about your sons? What do they know? What do they struggle with?" He paused. The question seemed to catch him somewhere he had not anticipated. "Walker is the oldest, 13. He can read well enough. Arithmetic gives him trouble. He's," a pause, "stubborn. Middle, Reuben, 11, bright but distracted. He'd rather be outside. And the youngest," something shifted in Cyrus Fairchild's face. "Eli, 9. He doesn't talk much. He will if he trusts you." Another pause. "He hasn't trusted many people." "I will do my best," Jennie said. Cyrus looked at her a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he turned and went back down the hall, and his footsteps were even and measured on the floorboards. She unpacked her books onto the shelf. Meeting the boys that first evening was like walking into a small, contained storm. Walker met her with his arms crossed and his chin up, already prepared to be unimpressed. Reuben was climbing the porch railing when she came out and didn't stop when he saw her. Just watched her sideways with the particular assessment of a child who is deciding whether you're worth the energy. Eli was standing slightly behind his brothers, and he looked at her with enormous dark eyes that were, she realized, exactly the same gray as his father's, just without the practiced containment. "Good evening," Jennie said. Walker said nothing. Reuben said, "You the new teacher?" "I am," Jennie said. "The last one cried," Walker said, clearly to see what she would do with that. "I've heard," Jennie said pleasantly. "And the one before that left in the middle of the night." Reuben blinked. "How do you know that?" "The stage driver told me." She looked at all three of them. "I'm going to tell you something true so we can start honestly. I know you've made this difficult for the women who came before me. I'm not going to pretend I don't know that or act as though it didn't happen. What I am going to do is teach you, and I am going to stay, and I would very much like to know your names from your own mouths." A pause. Then Eli from behind his brothers said quietly, "I'm Eli." "Hello, Eli," she said. "I'm Jennie." Walker's eyes narrowed. "Miss Cooper," he said, correcting her, and she could hear in it both the challenge and, underneath, the faintest ghost of the manners no one had bothered to teach him properly. "That's right," she said, and smiled, because it was the first correct thing she'd heard from any of them. "Miss Cooper, very good." Walker looked suspicious. He stayed suspicious for approximately 3 weeks, which was actually faster than she had expected. The first lesson happened the following morning at the kitchen table, because there was no schoolroom. Jennie had brought McGuffey readers and a slate board and chalk, and she set everything up at 8 o'clock as she had said she would. Walker arrived 7 minutes late openly, as a statement. Reuben arrived on time but immediately began tipping his chair back on 2 legs. Eli arrived first and sat with his hands folded on the table, watching her prepare with the focused attention of a child who had been starved for this without knowing it. The lesson itself was productive. She learned within the hour what she needed to know about each of them. Walker read well and used it as armor, refusing to engage with anything that required him to be uncertain. Reuben had a genuinely extraordinary mathematical mind, and was so bored by his current level that he had turned his intelligence entirely toward mischief. Eli was significantly behind the others in reading, but had an almost poetic sensitivity to language and story that was going to, if she handled it correctly, turn into his great gift. She said none of this to them directly. She simply taught. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation. Not a hostile one precisely, though there were moments. Walker locking himself in the outhouse with his reader and refusing to come out until she agreed to let him have a full hour of free writing time in the afternoons. She agreed. He came out. She gave him harder books. He stayed up reading them past midnight, which she discovered when she saw the lamplight under his door. And she knocked and told him 10 o'clock was the latest she permitted, and he said, "You can't tell me what to do," and she said very calmly, "You'll ruin your eyesight. It's not a rule for my sake, Walker, it's a rule for yours." He glared at her for a long moment and then blew out the lamp, and she heard him pull the covers up, and she thought, all right. Progress. Cyrus watched all of this from a careful distance. He ate breakfast before the boys most mornings, already heading out when she came in. He ate supper with the family, but conversations at the table were largely logistical: who needed to be where, what supplies were running low, whether the south pasture fence had been fixed. The boys spoke more freely when he was gone during the day. When he came in for supper, a different quality entered the room, something braced and careful. Jennie noticed it. She filed it away. The first time she and Cyrus had a real conversation, it was 2 weeks in, and it was because of the kitchen. She had come down to make tea at 7 in the evening, and found the kitchen in a state of considerable disorder. A pan left greasy on the stove, flour spilled across the work table, and evidence that someone had attempted to fry salt pork and thought better of it midway. She cleaned it. She did not consider this particularly unusual. She kept her own spaces tidy, and she was already here and it needed doing. When Cyrus came in from the barn an hour later, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the clean surfaces and then looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Would you like tea?" He stood there for a moment with the look of a man who cannot locate the correct response in a situation slightly outside his experience. "All right," he said finally, and sat down at the kitchen table. She made 2 cups and put one in front of him and sat across the table with her own. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it. "The boys gave you trouble today?" he asked. "No more than usual," she said. "Reuben put a grasshopper in my chalk box." I thanked him for adding natural history to our curriculum. Something happened at the corner of Cyrus's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "What did he do?" "He looked completely confounded and then laughed," Jennie said. "He is an exceptionally bright child, Mr. Fairchild. He needs material that challenges him." Cyrus was quiet. He turned the cup a quarter rotation. His mother used to say the same thing. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. Jennie did not push it, but she did not pretend she hadn't heard it either. "She sounds like she knew him well," she said. "She knew all of them." Another rotation of the cup. "She was better at." He stopped. "At the inside things," Jennie offered quietly. He looked up at her, and for the first time she had the full weight of his attention, unguarded, and it was considerable. "Yes," he said. "You've kept them alive and housed and fed and the ranch running," Jennie said. "That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal." He did not seem to know what to do with direct acknowledgement. He dropped his eyes back to the cup. "They need more than that." "Yes," Jennie agreed. "They do. But they also know, all 3 of them, that you would burn the world down before you let any harm come to them. That is something you have given them that I cannot. I can only add to it." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. "You're very direct," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said it slowly, as though he was figuring that out as the word left his mouth. "No, it's not." They sat in the kitchen another 20 minutes without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the companionable quiet of 2 people who had found an unexpected equilibrium. And when he got up and said good night and she said good night in return, something between them had shifted in a way that neither of them could have named yet, but both, she thought, could feel. The manners were not a planned curriculum. They happened organically, the way most important things do, out of necessity and close quarters, and Jennie's flat refusal to accept certain things as normal just because they had been normal for a long time. It started the 3rd week. Reuben reached across Walker at breakfast and grabbed the bread without asking, and Walker shoved him, and Reuben knocked over Jennie's coffee, and approximately 45 seconds of chaos followed. When it settled, Jennie looked at the 3 of them and said calmly, "We are going to begin something new." "What?" Walker said, in the flat tone he used when he anticipated something stupid. "We are going to learn how to be at a table with other people," Jennie said. "Which means you ask before you reach. You say please. You say thank you. Not because those are soft words or weak words, but because they are the words that tell other people that you see them, that they are worth your consideration." "Papa doesn't say them," Reuben said. Not accusatory, observational. Jennie thought about how to answer that. "Your father has a great deal on his mind," she said carefully. "And some habits are very old and very hard to change. But you are 11 years old and you are not too old to learn, and I promise you that the world will receive you better for it." "Why do we care how the world receives us?" Walker asked. This was a genuine question, not a challenge, which meant she had his attention. "Because you are going to live in it for a long time," Jennie said. "And how people receive you determines what opportunities you have, who trusts you with important things, who stands beside you when it matters. Kindness and courtesy are not weakness. They are power of a different kind." Walker was quiet, turning this over. Reuben was watching her with that same sideways consideration. Eli at the end of the bench said softly, "What do we do?" "You ask," she said. "Every time you want something at this table, you ask for it, by name to the person who can pass it. And you say please. That is all. That is where we start." There were 30 spectacular failures over the next 2 days. Jennie corrected each one without anger, without mockery, with patient repetition. By the 4th day, Walker asked Eli to please pass the butter and then looked mildly mortified about it. And Eli passed it with both hands and said, "You're welcome." And the look that crossed Walker's face was something complicated and new, like a door opening to a room he hadn't known was there. By the end of the second week of this, they had added eye contact. By the end of the third, they were greeting adults by name when they encountered them, which meant the ranch hands were suddenly being addressed as persons rather than furniture. And the reaction from those men was quietly, powerfully illuminating for all three boys. The foreman's assistant, a man named Pete who had worked the ranch for 7 years and been largely invisible to the Fairchild sons, stopped Walker one afternoon and said, "You said good morning to me today, son." And Walker said, "Yes, sir." And Pete said, "Your mama would have liked that." And Walker came inside with his eyes very bright and found Jennie in the kitchen and said, "Why didn't anyone teach us this before?" And Jennie said gently, because this was a moment that required gentleness. Sometimes the people who love us most are too busy surviving to teach us everything. That doesn't make the love less. It just means some things come later. Walker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you teach us more?" "Everything I know," she said. He nodded once very seriously and went back outside, and Jennie stood in the kitchen and felt something warm and certain settle in her chest. What she had not accounted for was Cyrus. He began to notice. She could see it at the supper table, the slight shift in his expression when Reuben said, "Please pass the salt," instead of lunging across the table. When Eli said, "Good evening, Papa," and actually met his father's eyes when he said it. When Walker, by the 5th week, began to rise from the table when Jennie entered the room, a courtesy she had mentioned once in passing as the kind of thing that showed respect for a woman's presence. Cyrus watched his eldest son stand up from the bench the evening of the 38th day and pull it out slightly so Jennie could sit. And something moved through the man's face like weather, fast and complicated and then gone. He didn't say anything that night. 2 days later he came in for supper and Eli said, "Good evening, Papa, how was the fence repair?" And Cyrus stopped completely still for a moment, and then he crouched down in front of his youngest son, who was still small enough for that to be natural, and he looked at him and said, "It went well, Eli. Thank you for asking." And he touched the back of Eli's neck briefly, and Eli's whole face lit like a match. Jennie did not cry. She concentrated very deliberately on the pot on the stove. It was the foreman situation that brought the confrontation. His name was Gerald Hobbs, and he had been with the ranch for 3 years, and he was, underneath the competence he projected, systematically defrauding Cyrus Fairchild in the supply accounts. Jennie discovered it by accident when Cyrus asked her during the 6th week if she could reconcile the kitchen supply receipts against the account book because he was behind on range work and needed the numbers before his meeting with the bank in Harrow Creek. She was methodical. She had always been good with numbers. She spent one evening going through the records and found $43.70 of discrepancy over 3 months, spread carefully across small amounts in a way that was designed not to be noticed. She told Cyrus the next morning. She had not anticipated his reaction. She had expected gratitude or perhaps skepticism requiring her to show him the figures. Instead, Cyrus went very still and his jaw tightened, and he looked at the account book and then at her and said, "You went through my account book. You asked me to reconcile the receipts," Jennie said. "The account book was necessary to do that. Hobbs has worked this ranch for 3 years. I know. And for 3 months he has been taking money from you. Here," she pointed to the entries. She was calm and clear about it because she was right and she knew she was right. What had followed was the confrontation. The plate against the wall, which had not been thrown at her, she understood that it had been a loss of control directed at the wall, a man hitting his limit. The words that followed, "Get out. I will not." And then Eli's small, shaking voice saying, "Please, Papa, please don't send her away." After Eli spoke, the room was silent for a very long time. Cyrus looked at his youngest son, and something broke open in him that was visible to everyone at that table, the boys who had never seen it and Jennie, who had seen the shape of it from the first day and had been patient. He sat down. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face and breathed. The boys looked at Jennie. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Wait." Cyrus lowered his hands after a moment. His eyes were dry but red at the rims. he looked at Eli first. "I'm not sending her away," he said. His voice was rough. "I'm sorry I said that." Eli nodded, still gripping the bench. Cyrus looked at Jennie. "Show me the figures again." She showed him. He looked at them for a long time, then he said, "I'll deal with Hobbs tomorrow." "All right," she said. He looked up at her. The fury was gone. What was left underneath it was something exposed and raw and genuinely exhausted. "I'm sorry about the plate," he said. "No one was hurt," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. "I shouldn't have." He said it carefully, the way a man says something that is not quite natural to him yet, but is, she realized, a man actively trying to be better in a moment of genuine difficulty. "I was wrong to lose my temper that way." "Acknowledged," she said, "and forgiven." He looked at her for a moment that was longer than any that had come before it, and she looked back, and something between them was different after that, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Gerald Hobbs was confronted the following morning. Cyrus did it privately, which was merciful, and Hobbs left the ranch that afternoon with what Jennie could only describe as remarkable speed. Cyrus recovered what he could of the money, and hired one of the younger ranch hands to take on the supply accounts under his direct supervision. The ranch hand's name was Thomas, who was 23 and good-natured and had no idea how to keep accounts. So for the next 2 weeks Jennie found herself teaching Thomas alongside the boys after supper in the evenings, while Cyrus watched from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. One evening she looked up from Thomas's account book to find Cyrus not in the doorway but actually in the room, seated at the end of the table, watching. Thomas went to bed at 9. The boys went to bed with some negotiation at 9:30. Jennie was gathering the papers when Cyrus, who had not moved, said, "You could charge extra for that." She looked up. "Teaching Thomas." "Teaching everyone who comes within range," he said. "I am here," she said. "The knowledge is not diminished by being shared." He was quiet. Then he said, "How did you become a teacher?" She sat down across from him because the question was a real one and it deserved a real answer. "I taught myself first," she said. "My family had books and I loved them beyond reason. When I was old enough, I went to the normal school in Cincinnati. When I finished there, I taught in the public school for 5 years until I was replaced by a less qualified man who was thought to be more appropriate to the role." "That's unjust," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is. But it is also what led me to private teaching and eventually to this advertisement. So perhaps the injustice had a plan I was not privy to." "Do you believe that? That things have plans?" She thought about it honestly. "I believe that some things that look like endings turn out to be redirections," she said. "I don't know if that is a plan or simply the way that time works when you stand far enough back from it." He was looking at her in the way he had begun to look at her since the confrontation, fully, without his habitual restraint. "What made you stay?" he said. "After that evening, the plate, I gave you every reason to go." "You gave your son a reason for me to stay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Eli." Eli said, "Please," she said. "I have encountered very few things in my life I could not walk away from. A 9-year-old boy saying please in a cracking voice is apparently one of them." Cyrus was quiet for a long time. His hands, resting on the table, were still. "He doesn't speak much in my presence," he said. "He used to before Helen." A pause. "Before his mother." "He talks to me about her," Jennie said carefully. "Is that all right?" Cyrus looked up. "He talks about her. He told me about the way she braided Reuben's hair when it was long. He told me about the smell of her bread. He told me she called him her little shadow because he used to follow her everywhere." She said it gently because these were tender things to hold. "He remembers her very clearly, and he misses her every day, and I think sometimes he doesn't know how to tell you that because he doesn't want to add to what you're already carrying." Something happened in Cyrus Fairchild's face that she had not seen before. It was not the breaking open expression from the confrontation. It was something quieter and more profound, the look of a man being given back something he thought was lost. "He should tell me," Cyrus said. His voice was very low. "Yes," Jennie said. "He should, and you should tell him. They all should, and so should you." He looked at her. "I don't know how to do that." "I know," she said, "but you are already learning. You told Eli his fence work was good this afternoon and touched the back of his neck, and he talked about it for 20 minutes after you went back out. You are already learning, Mr. Fairchild," he said very quietly. "Cyrus." She looked at him. "You've been here 2 months," he said. "My sons call you Jennie, and you've taught them to call me Papa instead of just standing in my general direction hoping I notice them. You could call me Cyrus." Her heart did something that was not particularly professional. "All right," she said. "Cyrus." He nodded once and got up and said good night and went down the hall, and she sat at the table for a little while after, listening to the nighthawks outside and the wind in the pines and her own pulse, which was behaving in a way she found somewhat inconvenient. June came. The high country summer arrived all at once, the way it did up here, and the days grew long and warm, and the boys spent more and more of their free time outdoors with the horses and the summer grass, and Jennie found her afternoons, when lessons were done, increasingly spent on the porch with a book or a letter, and the enormous Colorado sky overhead. She wrote to her sister in Cincinnati that things were going better than she had expected. She did not say more than that. Walker, by June, was reading Dickens of his own volition, and had stopped being hostile about mathematics when Jennie connected it to the ranch accounts and the money that had been stolen and how it might have been found sooner. She saw the moment it became real to him, not just numbers on a slate but a tool with genuine consequence. And after that, he applied himself with the same intensity he gave to everything else. Reuben she had largely liberated by giving him progressively more complex problems that he could solve outdoors, measuring the pasture fence with her folding rule and calculating the acreage, estimating the distance to the ridge in comparison to something he knew, applying geometry to the barn's roof angle. He was never happier than when he could take his mind outside, and she had stopped fighting it and simply moved the classroom to accommodate his nature. Eli was reading. This was the thing she was proudest of, the thing that had taken the most patience and the most care. He had come to her able to sound out simple words with enormous effort and visible shame, and she had recognized immediately that he had the kind of mind that learned letters differently, that needed stories first and mechanics second, and she had read aloud to him every evening for the first 3 weeks, not as a lesson, but simply as a gift. And she watched the shame dissolve and the interest rise, and one evening in late May he had reached over and taken the book from her hands mid-story and read the next paragraph himself, quietly, with one finger tracking under the line, and then looked up at her with an expression of stunned pride. She had said, "There it is." He had said, "I can do it." She had said, "You could always do it." He had been reading in every spare moment since then. It was a Saturday in June when Cyrus took the boys to town for supplies and Jennie stayed at the ranch, which was the first time she had been entirely alone there, and she spent the morning cleaning and the afternoon on the porch, and it was peaceful in the way that solitude is peaceful when you have enough people in your life that you can actually enjoy the quiet. When the wagon came back, the boys piled off with various packages, and there was a general chaos of unloading. And then Reuben appeared at her elbow with a slightly crushed paper package and thrust it at her. "From us," he said, looking sideways at the dirt. She unwrapped it. It was a book, a small volume of poetry, Emily Bronte, which she had mentioned once in passing during a lesson. The cover was worn secondhand, probably bought from the general store's small collection, but it was exactly what she had mentioned, and the thought of them asking, looking, finding it made something clench warmly in her chest. "Who chose this?" she asked. "All of us," Reuben said. He was still looking at the dirt. "Walker said the title. Eli said the author. I asked the store man." She looked past Reuben to where Walker was carrying a sack of flour and determinedly not looking at her, and Eli was watching her from beside the wagon with enormous eyes. "Thank you," she said to all of them, loud enough that Walker could hear. "This is one of the most thoughtful gifts I have ever received." Walker's ears went red. He disappeared into the barn. Eli smiled at her, his whole face in it. Cyrus, still on the wagon bench, was watching all of this. When she looked up at him, he quickly found something else to look at, but not quite quickly enough, and she looked down at the book and let herself smile at it privately. That evening after supper, while the boys were doing their evening chores, Cyrus came and sat on the porch beside her. She was reading the Bronte, and he sat in the other chair and stretched his legs out, and for a while they simply existed in parallel in the warm evening. "They picked that out themselves," he said. "Well, Walker picked it out. He argued with the store man for 10 minutes about which edition." Jennie looked up. "He argued." Apparently, the man tried to sell him something else, and Walker said he was very certain about what the teacher wanted. Cyrus's voice had a quality in it she was beginning to learn, the compression of something that might be amusement or might be something warmer and harder to categorize. "He is your best student." "They are all my best students in different ways," she said. "No," he shook his head. "Walker has become something he stopped. Something I had stopped expecting. He set the table tonight without being asked. I saw that. And he said please when he asked Reuben to move his elbow." A pause. "That's the first time I have heard Walker say please in 2 years." Jennie was quiet because this was one of those moments that needed space around it. "What did you do?" Cyrus asked, not accusatory. Genuinely wanting to know. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that people who feel seen are more likely to see others," she said. "That courtesy is vision, that when you ask rather than take, you are acknowledging that the other person exists and matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Simple," he said. "Entirely simple," she agreed. "The most important things usually are." He looked at the mountains. The sky was that impossible Colorado violet again. He stopped. He started again. "After Helen, the ranch was the only thing that kept us from losing everything. I worked it and I kept working it, and I told myself the boys needed the ranch to survive, which is true, and so the ranch came first. And I thought they were all right, that they were fed and housed, and I was there." "You were there," Jennie said. "That is not nothing, I mean that. But I wasn't present," he said. "There's a difference." She said nothing because he was working something out that he needed to work out himself, and she understood by now when to speak and when to hold the space. "Eli," he stopped, breathed. "The other night he came and sat next to me while I was doing the account books. He's never done that. He just sat there, and then he said, 'I miss Mama,' and another stop. I didn't know what to do. I said, 'I do too,' and then I didn't know what came next." "What did he do?" Jennie asked. "He leaned against my arm." Cyrus's voice was very even and very controlled. "That was all. He just leaned against my arm for about 10 minutes and then he went to bed." Jennie's throat was tight. "That is what came next," she said softly. "That was exactly right." Cyrus turned and looked at her. In the fading light, his face was open in a way she had never seen it, unguarded in a way that was not weakness but something harder and more honest than that. "He told me you taught them that," he said. "That sitting with someone is a kindness, that you don't always have to have words. I told them that words are one way to show someone they're not alone," she said, "but presence is another, and sometimes it is the truer one." He was looking at her steadily. "Why are you this way?" he said. "What way?" "This," he seemed to search for the word. "This good at seeing what people need." She thought about it honestly. "My mother was ill for most of my childhood," she said. "She needed a great deal of care, and she had a great deal of difficulty accepting it. I learned to offer help in ways that didn't make people feel diminished by needing it. I learned to watch for what someone couldn't ask for yet." He was very still. "I'm sorry about your mother." "She recovered," Jennie said. "Eventually. She's 71 now and runs a quilting circle in Columbus with an iron hand." The tension released slightly, and Cyrus made a sound that was undeniably a laugh, short and surprised, and Jennie felt it like a small bell going off in her chest. "That is the first time I have heard you laugh," she said. He looked at her, startled. "It's been a long time," he said. "I noticed," she said. "It suits you." He looked away. The color along his jaw, she thought, was slightly heightened, and she found this enormously and inappropriately satisfying. July was when she realized she was in trouble. She had known it was coming in the way you know certain weather is coming. You can feel it in the air before you see it. She had been careful. She had been professional. She had maintained the appropriate distances. And then July arrived, and all three boys convinced their father to spend a Sunday at the creek below the eastern pasture. And Cyrus arrived at the breakfast table on Sunday morning with his work shirt exchanged for a clean one and his hat in his hand, and said, with the particular awkward formality of a man doing something he is uncertain about, "We're going to the creek. The boys would like you to come." Just, the boys would like. She agreed immediately, because she was not, she told herself, made of absolute stone. The day at the creek was not dramatic or momentous in any obvious way. They rode out in the wagon with a basket Jennie packed, and the boys immediately stripped their boots and waded in, and Reuben caught 3 small trout by noon using a method he'd invented himself involving a bent pin and patience that Jennie found both impressive and slightly alarming. Walker sat on a flat rock and read, which was exactly what Walker did anywhere, but he occasionally looked up and joined conversations with an ease that had not been there 2 months ago. Eli found a crawdad and brought it to show Jennie, balancing it carefully on both palms, and explained its entire anatomy with the focused intensity of a future naturalist. And Cyrus sat on the bank with his boots off and his sleeves rolled and his hat beside him, and he watched his boys in the creek, and he was, she realized, simply happy. Not quietly enduring, not managing. Happy in the straightforward way of a man who has briefly laid down a very heavy thing and is sitting in the sun. He caught her watching him. She didn't look away quickly enough. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking that this is a good day." He looked back at the creek. "Yes," he said, "it is." They ate in the shade of the cottonwoods, Reuben's trout wrapped in the fat from the basket alongside bread and cold beans and dried apricots. And Walker taught Eli a card game he'd read about in a novel, and then had to be reminded by Jennie that she had not, in fact, taught him any card games. And he said, "I improvised," with such total dignity that she laughed, and Cyrus made that laugh sound again, the short, surprised one. And this time Eli heard it and looked up at his father with the biggest smile she had seen on the child's face. On the wagon ride home, the boys fell asleep in the back, all 3 of them, which she thought was possibly the most endearing thing she had ever witnessed. Walker's book open on his chest, Reuben curled like a hound, Eli's head on Reuben's shoulder. Jennie was sitting beside Cyrus on the bench, and the reins were loose and the horse was walking easy in the early evening. He said without preamble, "My wife's name was Helen Reyes Fairchild. She was from Santa Fe. She came up here with me when I was 30 and she was 28, and she thought this country was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen." A pause. She was right. She was right about most things. Jennie waited. "She died in the winter of '69. Fever. The doctor in Harrow Creek couldn't do much. She was gone in 8 days. His voice was flat and even with the effort of containment, but the grief in it was as old and as real as anything she had ever heard. Eli was 5. He barely, I don't know what he remembers exactly and what he's built from what we've told him. He remembers her smell and her braiding and her calling him her shadow," Jennie said quietly. Cyrus was very still for a moment. "That's real," he said. "Those things are real." "Yes," she said, "they are." He was quiet then. "I haven't talked about her like this in a long time." "You don't have to explain why," she said. "I know." He looked at the road. "I want to." He stopped. "That's the strange part. I want to." She looked at his profile in the long evening light, the gray at his temples, the weathered jaw, the set of his hands on the reins. She thought, "I am in a significant amount of trouble." She did not say this. She said, "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." "She was," he said. And so he stopped there. He didn't finish. "So are you." She thought that was what the sentence was, and she thought this as carefully as she had thought anything in her life. And then she looked at the Colorado sky going gold in front of them and kept it to herself. August brought the territorial election, and a man named Aldous Crane, who arrived at the ranch one afternoon with 3 other men, and a great deal of unearned confidence, asking to speak with Cyrus about the water rights on the South Creek that ran through the Fairchild property, and also, conveniently, the edge of Crane's adjacent land. Jennie was in the yard when they rode in. She had Eli with her, working on his letters in the open air, which she'd found he did better than indoors. Crane looked at her in the way some men look at a woman who is somewhere she apparently has no business being, which is to say as though she were furniture that has been placed inconveniently. "Schoolmarm," he said. "Schoolteacher," Jennie said pleasantly. "Mr. Fairchild is in the south barn. I'll tell him you're here." She went and told Cyrus, who came out with a particular quality about him, not hostile but very clearly not someone who was going to be moved. Jennie took Eli inside and continued the lesson at the kitchen table with the window open, which meant she heard the conversation in the yard in full, which she was not sorry about. Crane wanted access to the creek water. He wanted it formalized in a way that would give him more than his legal share. He presented this as a friendly arrangement between neighbors, and his voice had the undertone of a man who was used to being agreed with. Cyrus said, "I'll have my lawyer review any document before I sign it." Crane said, "That seems unfriendly, Fairchild." Cyrus said, "I'm not interested in being friendly about water rights. What I'm interested in is being correct." There was a pause, and then Crane said something low that she didn't catch, and then the sound of horses leaving. Cyrus came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "I heard the main points," she said. "I know," he said. He sat down. "He's been trying to get at that creek for 2 years. He owns the land east of it. If he gets formal water access, it effectively cuts the south pasture off from its only permanent water source. So you'd have to move the cattle north," she said. He looked at her. "You know ranching." "I know consequence," she said. "Can he make a legal argument for access?" "He's going to try. I need to get to Harrow Creek and talk to Patterson, he's the land lawyer there, before Crane files anything with the county." "Then go," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to know, not the open vulnerability of the evening conversations, but the simpler, more immediate look of a man who is realizing he can rely on someone. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. He was back by 4 in the afternoon, having apparently ridden considerably faster than the trip required, and when she asked, he said Patterson had the documents and would file the proper counterclaim with the county by end of week, and that was the end of Aldi's Crane. That evening at supper, Walker asked what had happened with the men who came, and Cyrus explained, briefly, the water rights situation and what he'd done about it. And then something new happened. Walker said, "Is there anything we can do to help?" And Cyrus looked at his 13-year-old son and said with real seriousness, "Yes, actually, I want you to learn how to read a land deed. Jennie can help you. Every man who owns land should understand what he owns." Walker sat up straighter. He said, "All right." And Jennie thought, watching the two of them look at each other across the table with this new and tentative thing between them, that this was what she had come for. Not just to teach letters and arithmetic, to be the hinge on which something could turn. She had not expected it to include her own heart. September was when it became impossible to pretend. It started with a letter from the school board in Denver, which she received on the 4th of September and read 3 times standing by the window of her room. They were establishing a proper school in Harrow Creek. They needed a head teacher immediately, salary of $22 a month, a full schoolroom, a proper position. Her references had been passed along by a Cincinnati colleague, and they were formally offering her the position. It was a better job by every external measure. More money, more students, a proper classroom, professional standing. She sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her lap, and looked at the shelf of books and the window facing east, and thought about Walker and his Dickens and Rubens' fence-line geometry, and Eli reading aloud to himself in the evenings, when he thought no one could hear him. She thought about an evening in late August when she had come down to make tea and found Cyrus at the kitchen table with Eli in his lap, reading aloud from a story book, Eli's finger tracking along under the words while his father read, and Cyrus had looked up and seen her in the doorway and gone still for a moment and then said, very quietly, "He asked me to read with him," and she had said good, and made her tea and sat down across from them, and the 3 of them had spent an hour like that. Eli between them, moving between the 2 people who had become his small, provisional world. She sat with the letter for a long time. She went to find Cyrus. He was in the office, working on the fall cattle accounts. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face in the first unguarded half-second before he arranged it was something she catalogued carefully and held close. "I received a letter from the Denver School Board," she said. She sat down across from him. "They are offering me a teaching position in Harrow Creek, head teacher of the new school, $22 a month." He was very still. "That's a better position than this one," he said. "By the money," she agreed. "When would it start?" "October 1st. He looked down at the account book. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "The boys." "The boys would be among my students," she said. "They could ride in daily or board in town. It would be a larger school, more students, a proper room with maps and proper texts. It would be good for them educationally." He said, "Is that what you want?" She looked at him. "I'm not sure what I want is what matters here." "It matters to me," he said, and the directness of it, the simplicity of it, dropped into the conversation like a stone into water. She was quiet. "Jennie." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for 2 months now, without the formality of Miss, and she had never stopped noticing it. "What do you want?" She said very carefully, "I want to know what you're asking before I answer." He looked up from the account book. His gray eyes were direct and serious, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had never in her life met someone who looked at a thing as squarely as this man. "I am asking," he said slowly, "whether the position in Harrow Creek is something you want to take because it is better for your career, or whether there is a reason you came to tell me about it instead of simply writing back to accept." She felt her heartbeat in her fingertips. "I came to tell you," she said, "because I did not want to decide without speaking to you. And I did not want to speak to you without knowing whether speaking to you was, whether it was appropriate." The word fell between them like a small, careful declaration. Cyrus pushed the account book aside. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I am going to say something," he said, "that I have not said in 4 years, and I would very much like you to not make it easier for me to not say it." "All right," she said. Her voice was entirely level, which was not how she felt. "I do not want you to go to Harrow Creek," he said. "Not because of the boys, though that is also true, because," he stopped. "Because I have been alive in this house since August in a way I had stopped expecting to be. Because I look for you in the mornings. Because when something happens on this ranch, the first thing I think is that I want to tell you about it. Because my youngest son reads. Because my oldest son says please." He stopped again. His voice, when he continued, was rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with stoicism. "Because you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time, and I would like one more stop. I would like you to stay, not as an employee. I want, if you would consider it, I am asking whether you would consider." "Cyrus," she said, because she could not let him continue to suffer for decorum. "Yes," he said. "I am not going to Harrow Creek," she said. "I think I knew that before I came to find you. I just needed to have this conversation." He looked at her. The breath he took was slow and careful. "Jennie." "Yes," she said. "I need you to know," he said, "that this is not a simple thing I'm offering. I have 3 sons and a ranch and a great many years of being closed, being absent in the ways that matter. I am working on that. You have shown me how, but I am not an uncomplicated man." "I have never wanted an uncomplicated man," she said. "I have never in my life been attracted to simplicity." Something broke open in his face, differently from the confrontation. This was not grief cracking, but something sealed from the inside, opening by choice, by intention. "Then would you?" he said. "Yes," she said, before he had the question finished. He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, that short, surprised laugh. And then his eyes were very bright, and he reached across the account book, and she put her hand in his, and his hand closed around it, warm and certain. They sat like that for a moment. Then Walker's voice came from down the hall. "Reuben, I told you not to put the milk crock on the chair." Followed by a crash, followed by Reuben explaining loudly that the chair had moved on its own. Cyrus looked at her. She looked at Cyrus. They both laughed properly this time, which meant she finally heard him laugh fully, and it was, as she had suspected, well worth waiting for. They told the boys at supper. Or rather, they told them after supper, sitting all together on the porch in the September cool. Cyrus said, directly, "I have asked Miss Cooper to stay here permanently. Not as your teacher, though she will continue to teach you." As he paused, "I have asked her to marry me." Walker looked at Jennie. His face was impossible to read for a moment. Then he said, "You said yes." "I did," she said. Walker was quiet for another moment. Then he said, and this was the Walker who had been building for months under the surface, the one who had been learning to see, "Good. This house is better with you in it." It was, Jennie thought, the most expensive thing Walker Fairchild had ever said, and he knew it, which was why he got up immediately after and went inside, but not before she saw his shoulders settle with something that looked very much like relief. Reuben said, "Does this mean you're our mother now?" Jennie said carefully, "I will never try to replace your mother. What I can be is someone who loves you and is here. What we call that, we can figure out together." Reuben looked at this for a moment. "Could we call you Jennie?" he said. "Like we already do." "Yes," she said, "exactly like you already do." Reuben seemed satisfied by this and began immediately planning the celebration meal he intended to cook, which required Cyrus to redirect him away from anything involving the cast iron pan without supervision. Eli hadn't said anything. Jennie looked at him, small and thoughtful, at the end of the porch step. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "She would have liked you," he said, very simply. "My mama, she would have liked you a lot." Jennie's throat was very tight. "Thank you, Eli," she said. "That means everything to me." He nodded with the gravity of a child who has given a great gift and knows it, and then climbed up and sat between her and Cyrus and looked at the mountains. And Cyrus put his arm around his youngest son, and Jennie put her arm around him from the other side, and they sat there as the stars came out over Colorado in their thousands. They were married in October, on a clear, cold Saturday, in the Harrow Creek Church. It was a small wedding. Pete the ranch hand came and shuffled awkwardly in his good coat. Thomas with the accounts came and was visibly emotional, which surprised everyone including Thomas. The Harrow Creek School Board representative, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, came because she had developed a considerable respect for Jennie and wanted to properly lament the position she was losing to the woman's personal happiness. The boys wore their good clothes and stood in a row in the front pew, Walker very straight, Reuben repeatedly straightening his collar with his finger, Eli watching everything with huge, intent eyes. When the preacher said, "Does anyone object?" Reuben said under his breath to Walker, "If anyone objects, I will fight them." And Walker said, "Quiet," but he was smiling, and Eli put his hand over his mouth to hide his laugh. Jennie wore the blue dress she had brought from Cincinnati, her best dress, and she carried 3 late dahlias from the ranch garden that she had managed to coax into a second bloom before the frost. Cyrus stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the aisle, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, open and certain, and she thought, completely happy. He held her hand through the ceremony, and his grip was steady and sure. When they were married, they rode back to the ranch in the wagon, all 5 of them, and Reuben announced that he was making the celebration supper entirely by himself, and everyone else was forbidden from the kitchen. Which meant Jennie and Cyrus sat together on the porch in the autumn afternoon and listened to Reuben clatter and swear softly in the kitchen while Walker supervised with the long-suffering patience of the eldest, and Eli narrated events from the doorway in a voice carefully calibrated to be just audible enough on the porch. "He dropped the pepper," Eli reported. "How much pepper?" Jennie asked. "All of the pepper." "Tell him to leave it and use the salt instead," Cyrus said. Eli relayed this. There was a pause, then Reuben's voice, "Fine, but it's his fault." "He says it's your fault," Eli reported. "He's right," Cyrus said. Jennie put her face against Cyrus's shoulder and laughed. He put his arm around her and held her there, and after a moment his face was in her hair and she felt him breathe. "Thank you," he said, "not for anything specific, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she said, "until you've tasted whatever Reuben is making." He laughed. She felt it through his chest. Supper turned out to be admirably edible. A stew that lacked several things and had twice the recommended amount of something else, but was genuinely made with effort and pride. And they ate it around the table by lamplight, all five of them. And Walker said it was acceptable, which was high praise from Walker, and Reuben glowed with it. And Eli asked for a second bowl and got one and was happy. Cyrus, at the head of the table, looked along its length at his family and then at Jennie, who was at the other end and looking back at him. And she thought she had never in her life seen a man look like that, as though something that had been dark for a long time had come back into light. October gave way to November. The boys continued their lessons, now formally in the parlor, which Jennie had converted with bookshelves and a proper map of the territories and a slate board hung on the wall. Walker was, by November, writing essays of genuine quality and had decided, confidentially to Jennie, that he wanted to go to college. She had said she thought that was an excellent idea. He had looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has never had their ambitions validated before and doesn't quite know where to put it. She told Cyrus that evening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We can make that happen. It'll take saving. We can make it happen." "You'll tell him that," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. He told Walker the next morning before breakfast privately in the barn. She heard about it from Eli, who had overheard from the hayloft, and who reported that Walker had said, "Are you serious?" approximately 4 times, and Cyrus had said yes each time, and Walker had eventually said thank you, and Cyrus had said work for it. "You will," and Walker had said I will, and they had shaken hands, which Eli described with enormous reverence. The winter was hard in the way that Colorado winters were hard, which was to say it was long and cold, and the snow came deep, and the work of the ranch in those months was relentless. But the house was different than it had been. There were lamps in the evenings and books on the table and the sound of boys doing their lessons or telling stories to each other in their room at night, which she could hear through the wall, Walker reading aloud to his brothers, Reuben interrupting to correct something, Eli asking questions. Jennie and Cyrus had taken to sitting together by the fire after the boys were in bed. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were simply quiet. She was learning that he was a man who had very deep reserves of thought and feeling that had been unexpressed for years, and that were now, slowly, coming back to the surface, not in floods but in steady, deliberate streams. A story about his father, a memory of when the ranch was first built, a thing that had worried him for months that he was now able to say aloud instead of carrying it alone. She told him things, too. About Cincinnati, about the mother who had been ill and then strong again, about the school board that had dismissed her, and how it had made her feel small and replaceable, and how she had fought her way back to knowing she was neither. He listened in the way he did everything completely without distraction, and when she finished he said, "They didn't deserve you." "No," she agreed, "but it brought me here." "It brought you here," he said, and reached over and laced his fingers through hers. By February, she knew she was expecting. She told Cyrus on a Sunday morning before the boys were up in the kitchen over the first coffee. She simply said it because she was not the kind of woman who managed information or delayed what needed saying. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up from the table and came around to her and put both hands on her face, very gently, and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. Because that was the first thing he asked, and she loved him entirely for it. "Perfectly all right," she said. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth. She could feel him shaking slightly, which was not something she had ever felt from him before and which she held like a sacred thing. They told the boys that afternoon. Reuben immediately had questions about logistics, where the baby would sleep, would it need the same food, what if it was loud. Walker was very quiet and then said, carefully, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" And Jennie said she didn't know yet, and Walker said, "Either way," and didn't finish the sentence, but the beginning of it was enough. Eli said nothing for almost an hour, during which she watched him thinking. Then he came to find her in the kitchen and said, "Jennie." "Yes," she said. "I'm glad," he said. "I think it's good." He paused. "I know it's different from before, it's still good." She pulled him into a hug, this 9-year-old boy who had taught her so much about what children needed just by showing her what had been missing. He hugged her back with his whole self. "It's very good, Eli," she said. "All of it." The baby arrived in late September, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. Born in the best season in high country, the aspens turning gold and the air sharp and clear as glass. He was a boy, which made Reuben's logistical planning somehow more manageable in his mind. They named him James, which had been Cyrus's grandfather's name, and which Jennie had agreed to immediately because it was solid and clear and suited the child, who arrived already opinionated about the world. Walker, at 14, was considerably more composed about the birth than Reuben, who had been in and out of the house approximately 17 times during the labor with various helpful reports, and Eli, who had spent the entire final hour sitting outside the bedroom door and praying quietly in a way that broke Jennie's heart with tenderness. When she called him in afterward and put James in his arms, Eli sat very still and looked at the baby's face for a long time. "Hello," Eli said to James softly. "I'm Eli. I'm going to teach you things." Jennie looked at Cyrus over Eli's head, and Cyrus was looking at his son holding his youngest child, and his eyes were very bright. "He'll teach him everything he knows," Cyrus said quietly. "Then James will be very well educated," Jennie said. James was not, in the early months, a quiet baby. He had strong opinions about his schedule, and expressed them clearly and at volume. This turned out to be the making of Walker, who, on the nights he took a watch without being asked, would walk the baby around the kitchen with a patience Jennie would not have predicted even 6 months before. He was 14 and tall and growing into himself with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and she watched him walk her son around the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the lamp low, James finally settling against his brother's chest, and she thought, whoever taught this boy was part of it, but so was he himself. She had told Walker that, not long after the night she'd witnessed it. She had said, "The person Walker is becoming is significantly the work of Walker." He had looked at her with that expression. The one she'd learned meant he was storing something away for a long time. "You started it," he said. "I opened a door," she said. "You walked through it yourself." He was quiet. "Then, will you write me a letter of recommendation for the college when the time comes?" "I will write you the best letter of recommendation ever composed in the Colorado Territory," she said. He had almost smiled. He was getting better at it. The following years were full. The ranch grew, cautiously, the cattle herd expanding as Cyrus's financial management improved, and the water rights situation resolved permanently in his favor. Walker went to the University of Colorado at Boulder at 17, on a combination of his father's savings and an academic scholarship Jennie had researched and helped him apply for. The afternoon he rode the stage to Denver to begin that journey, all of them standing in Harrow Creek to see him off. Cyrus shook his son's hand and then, without any particular ceremony, pulled him into a brief, firm embrace, and Walker held on for just a second longer than required. He wrote letters every week, to all of them. His letters to Eli were 20 pages long and full of the things he was discovering and reading, and Eli wrote back with equal length and enthusiasm, and they were, Jennie thought, the most educated correspondence between brothers in the territory. Reuben stayed with the ranch, which was exactly right for him. By the time he was 15, he understood the land mathematics of the operation better than the foreman. By 17, he was effectively managing the summer grazing rotation. He was going to be, Cyrus said one evening, the best rancher in the county in 10 years. 12, Jennie said, because she knew Reuben. Cyrus looked at her. "Why 12? "He'll spend 2 years trying to do it in 5 and learning why you can't," she said. "Then he'll do it properly." Cyrus laughed. She loved his laugh. She had loved it from the first time she heard it. Eli, at 12, began helping Jennie with the younger children in Harrow Creek who couldn't yet attend the proper school. She discovered this because one of the mothers came to the ranch to thank her, and she had no idea what the woman was thanking her for. and it emerged that Eli had been spending his Saturday afternoons in town, at the edge of the schoolyard, reading to a group of younger children who gathered around him like small planets around a quiet star. He had apparently told them nothing about himself except that reading was the best thing and he wanted to help. She told Cyrus that evening and he sat with it for a long time. "He gets it from Helen," Cyrus said. "She was like that. She gave things quietly without making a scene of the giving." "He gets it from you too," Jennie said. "The steadiness of it." He looked at her. "You are the steadiest person I know," she said. "You have never wavered from these children, not once." The rest was the silence, the distance that was grief and exhaustion, not absence of love. They always knew that underneath. I think that's why they came back so quickly. He reached across the evening table and put his hand over hers. He did this easily now, naturally, the way people touch each other when the habit of love has been long established. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "The night before you arrived," he said, "I almost wrote to cancel the engagement. I thought it was going to be disruptive and difficult and the boys would run you off in a week like the others and I was too tired for it. I almost wrote the letter." She looked at him. "What stopped you?" "Eli asked me what the new teacher's name was," he said, "and I told him Jennie Cooper." And he said it to himself a few times the way he does with new words, and then he said, "I hope she's nice." He hadn't hoped for anything that I could hear for about 6 months. I didn't write the letter. She felt the weight of it. What would not have been if the letter had been written? "Eli saved us," she said. "He usually does," Cyrus said. "He is the most extraordinary person." "He is your son," she said. "He is full of the things you gave him." Cyrus was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I used to think they were better off without me being involved. Involved in the way that matters. I thought I was too damaged was the word I used to myself. Too damaged by what happened. That I would do them more harm than good if I tried too hard. And now," she said, "now," he said, "I think that every single day I kept showing up, even when I was doing it badly, was something. That even the bad years counted for something. That we were never as lost as I thought." She moved her hand and laced her fingers through his. "You were never as lost as you thought," she said. "I saw the bones of this family the first week I was here. They were sound. They just needed the house to be rebuilt around them." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to it, a gesture that was still capable, after 3 years, of making her heart unsteady in the best way. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you." "I know," he said, which was exactly the right answer, and she laughed, and so did he. James turned 3 in the autumn that Walker graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in law. Walker came home for the summer before he established himself in Denver, and he arrived with a particular kind of authority he'd grown into without losing any of the fundamental Walker-ness that had always been there. He spent the summer reading cases under the cottonwoods and teaching James his letters with a patience Jennie had not entirely predicted but recognized from his teenage years, the way he had always, eventually, gotten there. Walker sat on the porch one evening with James on his knee, going through the alphabet, and Jennie stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them, and Cyrus came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. "Look at that," he said quietly. "I'm looking," she said. "Did you know," he said, "when you came here, did you have any idea it would become this?" "I knew nothing about what it would become," she said. "I knew $32, a trunk of books, and a letter that said no nonsense." "No nonsense," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "That was the best thing I ever wrote." "It absolutely was," she agreed. She turned, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in the kitchen doorway and watched Walker and James on the porch. And the mountains to the west were going gold in the evening, and the aspens were turning, and Reuben was coming in from the pasture on his horse. And somewhere Eli was writing a letter to someone, or reading to someone, or building something in the quiet way he built things. And the world was, in this moment, entirely full. In the spring following, Jennie found herself expecting again. This time she knew the signs earlier, and she told Cyrus in the kitchen, same as before, coffee and morning light, and his response was identical in its essentials, both hands on her face, the question of whether she was all right first. "Always," she said. "Good," he said and kissed her. The daughter arrived in November, which was appropriate because she came into the world entirely on her own terms and with a completely definite opinion about the temperature of the room. And they named her Helen, which Jennie had suggested, and Cyrus had received in silence for a long moment before he said yes, which she understood contained more than the word itself could hold. Eli, 14, held his sister with the same careful reverence he had held James, and told her very quietly that she was named after someone extraordinary who would have loved her very much. James, just turned 4, informed her that she was small but he would wait. The spring following James's 5th birthday and Helen's 1st, Jennie sat down at the kitchen table on an April evening with her grade book and her lesson plans for the following week, and she looked at the room around her. The scarred 10-foot table, the shelf of books that had moved from her room into the kitchen and multiplied considerably. The slate she'd hung on the wall years ago that now had a multiplication table and a copy of the preamble to the Constitution and 3-year-old Eli's first letter, carefully preserved. Cyrus came in from the porch, hat off, sleeves rolled, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at him. "April," she said. 14 of April, 1873. I came off the stage in Harrow Creek with $32 and a trunk." He came and sat across from her, same as he always had. "You were afraid," he said. "I was not afraid," she said. "I was cautious." "You were afraid," he said. "Just a little. You hid it very well." She considered denying it and decided that after 5 years of marriage the truth was more interesting. "Maybe a little," she said. "I was terrified," he said. She looked at him. "Of the whole thing," he said. "Of another teacher who would leave, of the boys watching someone else go, of—" He stopped. "Of the way you looked at me that first evening, like you were deciding what I was capable of." "I was deciding," she said. "And I decided you were capable of considerably more than you knew," she said. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Outside, James was playing in the yard with Helen's cloth doll, which Helen did not yet know about and which was going to cause a diplomatic incident shortly. Inside, from the direction of the parlor, Eli's voice could be heard reading something aloud, probably to himself, possibly to one of the cats, possibly to the air, because that was who Eli was. The ranch was full. The house was full. The table at which they sat was full every evening, and the sound of it was children and voices and laughter and occasional raised voices, and always, underneath it all, the particular sound of people who have found their right place in the world and are living in it without reservation. Jennie Cooper had come to Harrow Creek with $32 and a trunk of books to teach 3 boys their letters and arithmetic. She had taught them those things. She had also taught them to say please and thank you, to meet a person's eyes, to sit at a table as though other people matter, to ask before they take, to receive kindness without embarrassment, to give it without making a performance of the giving. She had taught them that strength and courtesy were not opposites, that the world received people differently when they moved through it with intention and care. Nobody had taught Cyrus Fairchild's sons any of it until she arrived, and they had wanted to learn. That was the part that still moved her, years later, sitting across from this man who had been so carefully sealed when she found him and was now so completely, unguardedly present. They had wanted it. Walker with his stubborn dignity and his enormous hidden hunger for someone to take him seriously. Reuben with his electric mind and his restless body that learned everything better when it was allowed to move. Eli, her particular Eli, her little shadow in return, who had been carrying grief too big for a 9-year-old and had needed someone to name it, hold it, make it smaller by keeping him company inside of it. They had wanted to learn. And in learning, they had shown their father what was possible, and their father had shown her what she had been making room for, all those years of doing good work and being undervalued and redirected, what it was that the universe had apparently been arranging toward the whole time. She thought about that sometimes, about plans she was not privy to. "What are you thinking now?" Cyrus asked. He knew her silences by their shape. "I'm thinking," she said, "that the advertisement said no nonsense, and I had $32 and a trunk of books, and I had no idea." No idea of what? She looked at him, this man she loved completely, this man who said please now without thinking about it, who had said I love you at the grave of his first wife last spring, and told her what he said there, which was that he was all right and that his sons were well, and that there was a woman who had seen him when he had forgotten how to be seen. No idea, she said, how full it would get. He smiled. His whole face in it, the way his youngest daughter smiled, Helen's smile, the one that came from somewhere before it arrived on the face, that started in the eyes and traveled. "Full is good," he said. "Full is very good," she said. James appeared in the kitchen doorway at this moment with Helen's cloth doll behind his back and a completely unconvincing expression of innocence. And the diplomatic incident commenced, and Cyrus went to mediate with the patient authority of a man who had been learning, for years, how to be present for the small things as well as the large ones. And Jennie sat at the scarred 10-foot table with her grade book and her lesson plans, and listened to her husband negotiate peace between a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. And somewhere in the parlor Eli was reading aloud, and outside the window the Colorado spring was arriving in its impossible, unreasonable beauty. And everything, every last thread of it, was exactly and completely where it was supposed to be.